Hey Grace Church, welcome to the weekly. My name is Josh. This is the week of January 9th, and today we are talking about prayer. So this week we looked at the story of Elijah, and he gives us a template on how we can engage our own lives and the temptations we face every day. One of the main temptations we face as people and as a church is the temptation of self-sufficiency, that we would go through this life living in our own power, operating in our own strength, believing if we don't do it, it's not going to happen. And I tried to say on Sunday that we should be a church that says, God save us from a self-sufficient mentality. And would we be people who are wise enough to recognize that there's a gap between where we are and where God wants us to go, and we need to fill that gap with extraordinary prayer. So in 1 Kings 18, we meet the prophet Elijah, and he is brought onto the scene under the kingship of a guy named Ahab, who historically was one of the most idolatry-filled, evil kings in all of Israel's history. And you've got the prophet Elijah showing up with King Ahab and his wife Jezebel, who have allowed so many false gods to take root in all of Israel, and primarily the prophet of Baal. And so in this, almost like this cinematic moment, Elijah calls for a competition on Mount Carmel between the prophets of Baal and himself, saying, let's call out to God, and whoever responds, that is the one true God. So the scene is set, and you've got all of these prophets of Baal that show up, and they are to call out to their God, and he is supposed to respond to them, and he does not respond. He is in fact silent, and Elijah provokes them, almost makes fun of them in certain moments, really saying, your God is not real. And they go to extraordinary measures trying to call to their God so that he would speak to them, and he doesn't. He remains silent. And when it's Elijah's turn, he builds the altar. And this is significant because the altar was the place of sacrifice, the place of commitment, the place of conviction, the place where God showed up and freed people from their sins and healed us. And the altar had been torn down, and so Elijah builds back the altar, and then he calls that the altar would be covered in water 3 times. And this is not how you start a fire, by the way. If you ever start a fire, you do not get the wood wet before you then start the fire. But he covers the altar 3 times in water, and then he prays that God would show up and God would speak. And God, the one true God, Yahweh, sends fire from heaven, totally overcoming the wood and drinking up all the water around, ultimately showing that he is the one true God and he is the one that speaks and hears us. And what we see in that story is a template that we can lay in our own lives. There is a part of our lives where God has to do it. The fire of God has to fall. And there's a part of our lives where we have got to be responsible enough to build the altar, so to say. So we've got to join God in saying, God, I'm going to move forward and I'm going to take the steps to live a holy life, to be committed, to walk in conviction, and I'm going to build the altar, and I'm going to do everything I can possibly do to make sure that you move. But I also recognize that, God, I can't do it. You've got to show up. You've got to be the one that supernaturally intervenes. So as a church, building off the story of Elijah, could we take this template and say, where in our lives do we need to put more responsibility? Where do we need to build the altar? In our marriage, in our parenting, in our commitment to the life of the church, where do we need to build the altar and take responsibility? And on the other hand, where do we need to call for God to supernaturally intervene because we can't do it? And so as a church, could we take this template and move forward saying we're going to build the altar and we're going to call for fire, and we're going to trust that God's going to do extraordinary things in our lives. So whether you're by yourself or with your spouse, or you're watching this with a Connect group, would you take a moment to be vulnerable and ask the question, where do I need to take some responsibility? Where do I need to build the altar, so to say? Or on the other hand, would you be honest and say, where do I need to call for God to supernaturally intervene? Would you be willing to share that with people around you if you have people around you? Or would you reflect on that if you are alone watching this video?